What would you do if you woke up in a strange land, surrounded by people who spoke a language you could not understand, and found yourself lying next to the daughter of the most powerful man in the village? What if every warrior in that village believed you had taken something sacred, something precious, something that could never be returned? This is not a story from a movie. This is not something someone made up to entertain you. This is the true account of Thomas Whitfield, a young British explorer who set foot on African soil in 1887 and found himself trapped in a situation that would change his life forever. He had come looking for gold. He had come looking for adventure. But what he found was something far more dangerous than any treasure. He found love in a place where love could get him killed. He found honor among people he had been taught to see as savages. And he found himself standing before 321 warriors who had gathered at dawn, not to fight him, but to witness his wedding to a woman he had met only hours before. This is his story, and once you start reading it, you will not be able to stop. Thomas Whitfield was born in the winter of 1862 in a small town called Ashford, located in the southeastern part of England. His father was a blacksmith who worked long hours shaping metal into horseshoes, farm tools, and sometimes weapons for the local hunting parties. His mother was a gentle woman who spent her days caring for Thomas and his three younger sisters. The family was not rich, but they were not poor either. They had enough to eat, a roof over their heads, and clothes on their backs. But Thomas always wanted more. Even as a young boy, he would sit by the window of their small cottage and stare out at the horizon, wondering what lay beyond the hills, beyond the rivers, beyond the sea. His father noticed this restlessness in him early on. One evening, when Thomas was about 10 years old, his father sat him down by the fire and told him a story. It was a story about a distant land called Africa, a place where the sun burned hotter than any forge, where animals the size of houses roamed free across endless plains, and where tribes of warriors lived by codes of honor that Englishmen could not even begin to understand. Thomas listened with wide eyes, his heart beating faster with every word. From that moment on, he knew that one day he would go to Africa. He did not know how. He did not know when. But he knew with absolute certainty that his destiny lay somewhere on that vast and mysterious continent. As Thomas grew older, his desire to explore only became stronger. He spent hours at the local library, reading every book he could find about Africa. He read about the great explorers like David Livingstone and Richard Burton. He read about the rivers that flowed through jungles so thick that sunlight could not reach the ground. He read about the mountains that rose so high that their peaks were covered in snow even though they stood near the equator. He read about the gold and diamonds that lay hidden beneath the earth, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to seek them. And he read about the people who lived there, the many different tribes with their many different customs, their many different languages, their many different ways of seeing the world. By the time Thomas was 18, he had made up his mind. He was going to Africa. He was going to find his fortune. He was going to become someone important, someone whose name would be remembered long after he was gone. But there was one problem. He had no money. His father could barely afford to keep the family fed, let alone pay for his son to travel halfway around the world. So Thomas did what many young men of his time did when they wanted to escape their circumstances. He joined the British Army. The army was hard. The training was brutal. The officers were cruel. And the other soldiers were rough men who had little patience for a dreamer like Thomas. But he endured it all. He endured the early morning drills, the long marches through rain and mud, the constant yelling and punishment. He endured it because he knew it was his only path to Africa. The British Empire had interests all over the continent. There were wars being fought, colonies being established, resources being extracted. If he served well enough, if he proved himself useful enough, he might just get his chance to set foot on African soil. 5 years passed. Thomas rose through the ranks, slowly but steadily. He was not the strongest soldier, but he was smart. He was resourceful. He could read and write, which set him apart from many of his fellow soldiers. He learned to speak French and some basic Arabic, languages that were useful in the parts of Africa where the British had influence. And, most importantly, he learned to survive. He learned to read the land, to find water where there seemed to be none, to track animals and men through thick brush, to stay calm when everything around him was chaos. In the spring of 1887, Thomas finally got his wish. He was assigned to a small expedition that was being sent to West Africa. The official purpose of the expedition was to establish trade relations with several coastal communities. But everyone knew the real purpose. They were looking for gold. Rumors had been circulating for years about vast deposits of gold hidden somewhere in the interior, guarded by tribes that had never been contacted by Europeans. The British government wanted that gold, and they were willing to send men into the unknown to get it. The expedition consisted of 20 men. There was Captain Edward Marsh, a stern man in his 50s who had spent most of his life in various parts of the empire. There was Lieutenant James Harrington, a young aristocrat who had joined the army more for adventure than duty. There were 12 regular soldiers, hardened men who followed orders without question. There were 2 guides, African men who had been hired in Lagos and who claimed to know the interior. There was a doctor named William Price, a nervous man who seemed more interested in collecting plant specimens than treating wounds. And there was Thomas, serving as the expedition's quartermaster, responsible for supplies and logistics. They set sail from Portsmouth on a gray morning in April. The ship was called the HMS Endeavour, a steam-powered vessel that had seen better days. The journey across the Atlantic took 3 weeks. Thomas spent most of that time standing at the bow of the ship, staring at the endless expanse of water, thinking about what lay ahead. He was excited, more excited than he had ever been in his life. But he was also scared. He had heard stories about Africa, about the diseases that could kill a man in days, about the animals that could tear a man apart in seconds, about the tribes that did not welcome strangers. He knew that many men had gone to Africa and never returned. He knew that he might be one of them. They arrived at the port of Lagos in early May. The heat hit Thomas like a wall the moment he stepped off the ship. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The air was thick and heavy, filled with smells he could not identify. The sun beat down without mercy, turning the world into a shimmering haze. Everywhere he looked, there was movement, color, life. People crowded the docks, buying and selling goods, shouting in languages he did not understand. Animals wandered freely through the streets. Buildings made of mud and wood stood next to structures built by Europeans. It was chaos. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. The expedition spent 2 weeks in Lagos, gathering final supplies and making preparations for the journey inland. Thomas used this time to learn as much as he could about the region they would be traveling through. He spoke with traders, missionaries, and local officials. He studied maps and charts, trying to memorize every river, every mountain, every village that had been recorded. He also tried to learn some of the local languages, though he found this much harder than he had expected. The sounds were strange to his ears, and the grammar followed rules he could not grasp. Still, he managed to pick up a few words and phrases, enough to ask for water, food, and directions. On the morning of May 20th, the expedition set out from Lagos. They traveled in a long column, with Captain Marsh at the front and Thomas somewhere in the middle, keeping an eye on the pack animals that carried their supplies. The first few days were relatively easy. They followed well-established trade routes, passing through villages where they were greeted with curiosity, but not hostility. The local people had seen Europeans before. They knew what to expect. They traded food and information for beads and cloth, the currency of choice in this part of the world. But as they moved further inland, the landscape began to change. The coastal plains gave way to dense forests. The well-worn paths became narrow trails that seemed to disappear entirely in places. The villages became smaller and more spread out. The people became more wary, less willing to trade, more likely to disappear into the trees at the first sight of the expedition. The guides grew nervous. They said they had never been this far before. They said they did not know what lay ahead. Captain Marsh was not pleased to hear this, but he pushed on regardless. They had come too far to turn back now. 2 weeks into the journey, disaster struck. They were crossing a river when one of the boats capsized. 3 men drowned, including Lieutenant Harrington. Several crates of supplies were lost, including most of their medicine. Dr. Price, who had been on the boat that capsized, survived but was badly shaken. He began talking about turning back, about how the expedition was cursed, about how they would all die if they continued. Captain Marsh silenced him with a sharp look and ordered the expedition to continue. But the losses did not stop there. Over the next few days, 2 more men died from fever. Another was bitten by a snake and had to have his leg amputated. The guides, sensing that things were going badly, disappeared one night without warning. The expedition was now lost in the middle of an unknown forest with no idea where they were or which direction to go. Morale plummeted. The men began arguing among themselves. Some wanted to turn back. Others wanted to press on. Captain Marsh tried to maintain order, but even he seemed uncertain about what to do. Thomas watched all of this with growing concern. He had dreamed about Africa for so long, had worked so hard to get here, and now it seemed like everything was falling apart. But he refused to give up. While the others argued, he studied the terrain. He looked at the position of the sun, the direction of the rivers, the patterns of the birds. He remembered something he had read in one of his books about how certain tribes lived near rivers that flowed from the east. If they could find such a river and follow it upstream, they might be able to find people who could help them. He shared his idea with Captain Marsh. The captain was skeptical at first, but he had no better options. He agreed to let Thomas lead the expedition eastward in search of a river. For 3 days they walked, pushing through thick undergrowth, fighting off insects that seemed determined to devour them alive. Thomas began to doubt himself. What if he was wrong? What if he was leading these men to their deaths? But on the 4th day, just as he was about to give up, they heard it. The sound of rushing water. They had found a river. The men cheered. Even Captain Marsh smiled, something Thomas had never seen him do before. They made camp by the river and rested for a full day, washing off weeks of dirt and grime, catching fish, refilling their water containers. Spirits were high for the first time since they had left Lagos. Maybe, just maybe, they were going to make it after all. They followed the river upstream for another week. The forest began to thin out, replaced by rolling grasslands dotted with acacia trees. The air grew drier, but no less hot. And then, on a morning that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life, they saw something that made them stop in their tracks. Smoke, rising from beyond a hill. Where there was smoke, there were people. The expedition had found what it was looking for. Captain Marsh called the men together and gave them strict instructions. They were to approach peacefully. They were not to make any threatening gestures. They were to let him do all the talking. Thomas noticed that the captain seemed nervous, more nervous than he had been at any point during the journey. He understood why. They had no idea what kind of people they were about to meet. They could be friendly traders. They could be hostile warriors. They could be anything in between. The expedition crested the hill and looked down into a valley. What they saw took their breath away. Below them was a village, but unlike any village they had seen before. It was large, much larger than they had expected, with hundreds of huts arranged in concentric circles around a central clearing. In the clearing, there was a large structure made of wood and thatch, decorated with carvings and paintings. People moved about the village, going about their daily activities, seemingly unaware of the strangers watching them from the hill above. Thomas felt his heart racing. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for his entire life. He was standing at the edge of the unknown, about to step into a world that no European had ever seen before. He had no idea what would happen next. He had no idea that within 24 hours, he would be lying next to the daughter of the chief, surrounded by warriors who wanted him dead, facing a choice that would determine the course of his entire future. Captain Marsh gave the signal, and the expedition began its descent into the valley. The people of the village noticed them almost immediately. There was shouting, movement, chaos. Within minutes, the expedition was surrounded by dozens of warriors armed with spears and shields. The warriors did not attack, but they did not back down either. They stood in a circle around the Europeans, their eyes hard, their bodies tense, ready to strike at the first sign of aggression. Captain Marsh raised his hands in a gesture of peace. He tried speaking in English, then French, then Arabic. The warriors did not respond. They simply stared, waiting. Thomas watched the scene with growing anxiety. He could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, and they would all be dead. Then, something unexpected happened. An old man emerged from the crowd of warriors. He was tall and thin, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that seemed to see everything. He walked up to Captain Marsh and studied him for a long moment. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he spoke in heavily accented but recognizable English. "Why have you come here?" Captain Marsh blinked in surprise. "You speak English?" "I speak many languages," the old man replied. "I have traveled far in my youth. I have met your kind before. I ask again, why have you come here?" Captain Marsh hesitated. Thomas could see him weighing his options, trying to decide how much to reveal. Finally, he said, "We are explorers. We have come in peace. We seek only to trade and to learn about your people." The old man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You lie? Your kind always lies. You come for gold. You come for land. You come to take what does not belong to you." "We mean no harm," Captain Marsh insisted. "We are lost. We need food and supplies. We are willing to pay." The old man considered this for a long moment. Then, he turned and spoke rapidly to the warriors in a language Thomas did not understand. There was a brief discussion, with several warriors clearly disagreeing with whatever was being proposed. But, in the end, the old man seemed to win the argument. He turned back to Captain Marsh and nodded. "You will come with us. You will meet our chief. He will decide what to do with you." The warriors parted, creating a path toward the village. Captain Marsh looked at his men, took a deep breath, and began walking. The others followed, Thomas among them. As they walked, the villagers gathered to watch, pointing and whispering. Children ran alongside them, laughing and shouting. Women peered out from doorways, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. It was like walking through a dream, Thomas thought. A strange, vivid, terrifying dream. They reached the large structure in the center of the village. Up close, Thomas could see that the carvings on its walls depicted scenes of battle, hunting, and what looked like religious ceremonies. The old man led them inside. It took a moment for Thomas's eyes to adjust to the dim interior. When they did, he saw that they were in a large room, furnished with woven mats and decorated with animal skins and feathers. At the far end of the room, seated on a raised platform, was a man who could only be the chief. He was not what Thomas had expected. He had imagined a fierce warrior, covered in scars and wearing a fearsome expression. But the chief was a man of medium build, perhaps 50 years old, with a calm face and intelligent eyes. He wore a simple robe of white cloth, and his only adornment was a necklace made of what looked like lion's teeth. He sat perfectly still, watching the strangers with an expression that revealed nothing. The old man approached the chief and spoke to him quietly. The chief listened, nodding occasionally, his eyes never leaving the Europeans. When the old man finished speaking, the chief was silent for a long moment. Then, he spoke, his voice deep and resonant. The old man translated. "The chief welcomes you to his village. He says that you are the first white men to reach this place. He is curious about you. He wants to know more about your people, your customs, your intentions." Captain Marsh stepped forward. "Tell the chief that we are honored by his welcome. Tell him that we come from a land far across the sea, a land called England. Tell him that we seek only peace and friendship." There was more translation, more conversation. Thomas watched and listened, trying to pick up what he could from the tone and body language of the speakers. It seemed like things were going well. The chief did not seem hostile. He seemed genuinely curious about these strange visitors. Maybe they would get the supplies they needed. Maybe they would even find the gold they were looking for. Maybe everything was going to be all right. But then, something happened that changed everything. A young woman entered the room. She came through a side entrance, moving quietly, carrying a tray of food. She was beautiful, stunningly beautiful, with dark skin, high cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to shine with their own light. She wore a simple dress of colorful cloth, and her hair was arranged in an elaborate style decorated with beads. Thomas could not stop staring at her. He had never seen anyone like her. It was as if the world had suddenly narrowed to just the two of them, everything else fading into the background. She placed the tray before the chief and began to withdraw. But, as she turned, her eyes met Thomas's. For a brief moment, they looked at each other. Then, she looked away and left the room. "Who was that?" Thomas whispered to the old man, who happened to be standing nearby. The old man looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. "That is Amara. She is the daughter of the chief. She is promised to no man. She is sacred." Thomas nodded, but he could not get her face out of his mind. He could not explain what had happened when their eyes met. It was like something had passed between them, something powerful, something that he did not understand but could not ignore. The meeting continued. Food was served. Captain Marsh continued to negotiate, trying to secure supplies and possibly guides to help them find their way back to the coast. The chief listened and asked questions through the old man. He seemed particularly interested in the weapons the Europeans carried, the strange metal tubes that could throw fire and death. Captain Marsh was careful in his answers, trying to satisfy the chief's curiosity without revealing too much. As the hours passed and the sun began to set, the chief announced that the Europeans would be his guests. They would be given a place to sleep and food to eat. In the morning, they would talk more about trade and other matters. Captain Marsh accepted graciously, and the men were led to a large hut on the edge of the village. Thomas lay on his mat that night, unable to sleep. The sounds of the African night surrounded him, insects chirping, animals calling, the wind rustling through the thatch roof. But He was not thinking about any of that. He was thinking about her. About Amara. About the way she had looked at him. He knew it was foolish. He knew it was dangerous. He knew nothing could ever come of it. But he could not stop thinking about her. And that was when he made the decision that would change his life forever. He got up. He slipped past the sleeping soldiers. He walked out into the night. He did not know where he was going. He did not have a plan. He just knew that he had to see her again. He had to know if what he had felt was real or just his imagination. He had to know. The village was quiet. Most people were asleep. Thomas moved carefully, staying in the shadows, making his way toward the center of the village where the chief's residence stood. He did not know what he would do when he got there. He did not know if he would find her. He did not know anything except that he could not turn back now. He reached the chief's residence and circled around to the side. There was a smaller structure attached to the main building, probably quarters for family members. He stood there in the darkness, listening, waiting, feeling like a fool. What was he doing? This was madness. He should go back. He should forget about her. He should focus on the mission. But before he could make up his mind, he heard a voice behind him. You should not be here. He spun around. It was her. Amara. She stood a few feet away, wrapped in a shawl, her eyes glinting in the moonlight. She looked angry, but also something else. Curious, perhaps. Maybe even a little amused. I'm sorry, Thomas stammered. I didn't mean to. You just what? She asked. Her English was good, much better than the old man's. She must have learned from someone, Thomas thought. A missionary, perhaps, or a trader who had passed through years ago. I wanted to see you, Thomas said. It was the truth, even if it sounded stupid saying it out loud. Amara stared at him for a long moment. Then, to his amazement, she smiled. You are brave. Or foolish. Maybe both. Probably both, Thomas admitted. She laughed, a soft sound that seemed to fill the night air. Come. We cannot talk here. Follow me. She led him away from the chief's residence, through a maze of smaller huts, to a spot near the edge of the village where a large tree stood overlooking the river. They sat beneath the tree, and they talked. They talked for hours, as the moon crossed the sky and the stars wheeled overhead. She told him about her life, about growing up as the daughter of a chief, about the responsibilities and restrictions that came with her position. He told her about England, about his dreams of exploration, about how he had come to be in this strange land so far from home. By the time the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, Thomas knew two things with absolute certainty. First, he was in love with Amara. Second, he was in terrible, terrible trouble, because as they talked, they had moved closer together. And, at some point, without either of them quite realizing how it happened, she had fallen asleep with her head on his shoulder. And he had fallen asleep beside her. And that was how the warriors found them when they came looking at first light. Thomas awoke to the sound of shouting. He opened his eyes and saw dozens of warriors surrounding them, their faces twisted with rage, their spears pointed at his chest. He tried to speak, tried to explain, but there was nothing he could say. The evidence was clear. He had been found sleeping beside the chief's daughter. In this culture, that meant only one thing. Within minutes, the entire village was awake. People came running from every direction, shouting, pointing, demanding justice. The old man appeared and tried to calm things down, but even he seemed shaken by what had happened. Captain Marsh arrived with the other Europeans, their faces pale with fear and confusion. What did you do? Captain Marsh hissed at Thomas. Do you have any idea what you've done? Before Thomas could answer, the chief emerged from his residence. The crowd fell silent immediately. He walked slowly toward where Thomas and Amara stood, surrounded by warriors. His face was like stone, revealing nothing. He looked at his daughter, then at Thomas, then back at his daughter. He spoke a single word, and two warriors stepped forward and seized Thomas by the arms. The old man translated. The chief says that you have taken something that cannot be returned. You have dishonored his daughter. You have dishonored his family. You have dishonored his entire village. Please, Thomas said, nothing happened. We only talked. I swear to you, nothing happened. The old man shook his head sadly. It does not matter what happened. It matters what people saw. And what people saw was a stranger sleeping beside the sacred daughter of the chief. There is only one way this can end. Thomas felt his heart sink. Death. The old man smiled, but there was no humor in it. No, not death. Marriage. Thomas blinked. What? You must marry her. It is the law. It is the only way to restore honor. If you refuse, you will die. If you accept, you will become one of us. You will live here. You will never leave. Thomas looked at Amara. She stood with her head bowed, her face unreadable. He looked at Captain Marsh, whose expression was a mixture of horror and disbelief. He looked at the warriors surrounding him, their spears still raised, their eyes still hard. He looked at the chief, waiting for his answer. The sun was rising now, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. And, as Thomas stood there, trying to process what was happening, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the sound of drums. It was the sound of warriors gathering. It was the sound of his fate being sealed. By the time the sun had fully risen, 321 warriors had assembled in the central clearing. They had come from the village and from neighboring communities. They had come to witness what would happen next. They had come to see if this stranger would live or die. Thomas Whitfield, the boy from Ashford who had dreamed of Africa his entire life, now faced the most important decision he would ever make. The woman he had fallen in love with stood waiting. The warriors stood watching. The chief stood judging. And, as the drums continued to beat, Thomas opened his mouth to give his answer. The drums seemed to grow louder with each passing second. Thomas could feel them in his chest, matching the frantic rhythm of his heartbeat. 321 warriors stood in a massive circle around the clearing, their faces painted, their bodies decorated with feathers and animal skins, their weapons gleaming in the early morning light. He had never seen anything so terrifying in his entire life. He had never felt so small, so vulnerable, so utterly alone. Captain Marsh had been pushed to the edge of the crowd along with the other Europeans. They were surrounded by guards who made it clear that any attempt to intervene would be met with immediate violence. Thomas caught the captain's eye and saw something he had never seen there before. Helplessness. The man who had led them through jungles, across rivers, and into the unknown had no idea how to handle this situation. For the first time since they had left England, they were completely at the mercy of forces beyond their control. The chief sat on a raised platform at one end of the clearing. He wore ceremonial robes now, elaborate garments covered in intricate patterns that Thomas did not understand. On his head was a crown made of gold, actual gold, the first evidence Thomas had seen that the rumors about treasure in this region might be true. But he was not thinking about gold now. He was not thinking about treasure or glory or any of the things that had brought him to Africa. He was thinking about survival. He was thinking about the woman who stood near her father, her eyes still downcast, her fate as uncertain as his own. The old man who had served as translator stepped into the center of the clearing. He raised his hands, and the drums stopped. The silence that followed was almost more frightening than the noise had been. It was the kind of silence that precedes something terrible. It was the kind of silence that changes lives. The old man began to speak in a voice that carried across the entire clearing. He spoke in the local language first, telling the story of what had happened. Thomas could not understand the words, but he could read the reactions of the crowd. There were gasps, murmurs, angry shouts. People pointed at him with expressions of disgust and outrage. He was the stranger who had violated their most sacred traditions. He was the outsider who had brought shame upon their chief's family. He was the enemy. When the old man finished speaking in the local language, he turned to Thomas and switched to English. His voice was quieter now, meant only for Thomas to hear. "You are in great danger," he said. "Many of our warriors want you dead. They say you have defiled the sacred daughter. They say your blood must be spilled to restore honor." The chief is not sure what to do. He is a fair man, but he is also a proud man. His daughter is everything to him. She is his only child, the only reminder he has of his wife, who died giving birth to her. "Do you understand what I am saying?" Thomas nodded. His throat was dry, and when he tried to speak, his voice came out as barely a whisper. "What can I do?" "There is only one way to save yourself," the old man said. "You must agree to marry the chief's daughter. If you become her husband, the shame is erased. You become part of our people, part of our family. No one can harm you without harming the chief himself. And if I refuse?" The old man's expression was grim. "Then you will be executed. And so will your companions. The chief cannot let this insult go unpunished. Too many people have seen. Too many people know. If he shows weakness now, he will lose the respect of his warriors. And a chief without respect is no chief at all." Thomas looked at Captain Marsh again. The captain seemed to understand what was being discussed. His face had gone pale, and he was shaking his head slightly, as if warning Thomas not to do anything foolish. But what choice did he have? If he refused, they would all die. If he agreed, at least the others might have a chance to escape. But there was more to it than that, and Thomas knew it. He had felt something when he looked at Amara. He had felt something when they talked through the night. He had felt something when he woke up with her beside him, even in that moment of terror when he realized what had happened. Was it love? He did not know. How could anyone know after just one night? But it was something. Something real. Something he had never felt before. And the thought of never seeing her again, of leaving this place, and never knowing what might have been, was somehow more frightening than the thought of staying. I need to speak with her, Thomas said. Before I decide anything, I need to speak with Amara. The old man looked surprised. That is not how it is done. The decision is yours to make. Her wishes do not matter. They matter to me, Thomas said firmly. I will not force myself on a woman who does not want me. I need to know how she feels. There was a long pause. The old man seemed to be wrestling with something, some internal debate that Thomas could not see. Finally, he nodded. Wait here. I will speak with the chief. The old man walked to the platform and knelt before the chief. They spoke quietly for several minutes. Thomas watched as the chief's expression shifted, cycling through anger, confusion, and something that might have been curiosity. Finally, the chief nodded and made a gesture toward his daughter. Amara looked up, clearly surprised. She exchanged words with her father, then slowly walked toward the center of the clearing where Thomas stood. They faced each other in front of 321 warriors, the entire village watching, the fate of both their lives hanging in the balance. Thomas had no idea what to say. Every word he spoke could be his last. Every word could determine whether he lived or died. Amara, he began, his voice steadier than he felt. I know this is not how either of us imagined our lives would go. I know you had your own dreams, your own plans, your own future. And I know that I am a stranger, an outsider, someone who does not belong here. But I need you to tell me the truth. Do you want this? Do you want me to be your husband? Because I will not agree to something that makes you unhappy. I would rather die than be the cause of your misery. Amara was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but Thomas heard every word clearly. Last night, when we talked under the tree, you asked me what I wanted most in the world. Do you remember what I said? Thomas nodded. You said you wanted to see what lay beyond the horizon. You said you were tired of being kept in a cage made of tradition and expectation. You said you wanted to be free. And do you remember what you said in response? I said I had spent my whole life chasing the horizon, only to discover that the thing I was looking for was not a place, but a feeling of belonging, a feeling of being home. Amara smiled, the same smile that had captivated him the night before. When I woke up this morning and saw you beside me, I was scared, more scared than I have ever been. But underneath the fear, there was something else. There was peace. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. So you want me to say yes? I want you to do what your heart tells you to do. Not because of fear, not because of duty, but because of what you truly feel. Thomas looked at her. He looked at the warriors surrounding them. He looked at the chief sitting on his platform. He looked at Captain Marsh and the other Europeans, their faces filled with anxiety and confusion. He thought about everything he had left behind in England. He thought about everything he had dreamed of finding in Africa. And then he thought about what he had actually found. Not gold, not glory, but something far more valuable. Something he had never expected. He turned to the old man. Tell the chief that I accept. I will marry his daughter. I will become part of your people. The old man translated. There was a moment of silence, and then the drums began again, but this time their rhythm was different. This time, they carried a note of celebration rather than threat. The warriors lowered their weapons. The crowd began to cheer. And the chief, for the first time since Thomas had seen him, smiled. What followed was a whirlwind of activity. Thomas was taken to a special hut where he was bathed and dressed in traditional clothing. His European garments were taken away, and he was given a robe similar to what he had seen the men of the village wearing. His skin was painted with designs that the old man explained were symbols of protection and good fortune. A necklace was placed around his neck, a string of beads that signified his acceptance into the tribe. Meanwhile, the village transformed around him. Preparations for the wedding ceremony began almost immediately. Women set up cooking fires and began preparing vast quantities of food. Men erected a special pavilion in the clearing where the ceremony would take place. Children ran everywhere, excited by the unusual activity, their laughter filling the air. It was chaos, but it was joyful chaos, and Thomas found himself swept up in it despite everything. Captain Marsh managed to get a message to him through the old man. The captain wanted Thomas to know that he understood. He said that they would stay for the ceremony, but then they would need to return to the coast. He said that he would report Thomas as lost in the jungle, killed by fever or wild animals. That way, Thomas would not be classified as a deserter. That way, his family in England would receive his military pension. That way, some good might come from this strange situation. Thomas was grateful for the captain's understanding, but he felt a pang of sadness as he thought about his family back home. His mother and father, his sisters, they would think he was dead. They would mourn him. They would never know what really happened, where he really ended up, what his life actually became. It was a heavy weight to bear, but it was the price of the choice he had made. As evening approached, Thomas was brought to the pavilion. The ceremony was about to begin. The entire village had gathered, along with visitors from neighboring communities. He estimated that there were now over 1,000 people present, all of them watching, waiting, bearing witness to this extraordinary event. Amara arrived escorted by her father. She was dressed in clothing so beautiful that Thomas could hardly believe his eyes. She wore a gown of white and gold, covered with beadwork that must have taken months to create. Her hair was decorated with flowers and jewels. Her face was painted with delicate patterns that enhanced her natural beauty. She looked like a goddess descending from the heavens, and Thomas felt his heart stop for a moment as she approached. The ceremony itself was unlike anything Thomas had ever experienced. The old man served as the officiant, speaking in both the local language and English so that Thomas could understand what was happening. There were prayers to ancestors, offerings to spirits, and rituals that Thomas did not fully comprehend but participated in with as much respect as he could muster. At one point, he and Amara were required to walk 7 times around a sacred fire. At another point, they had to drink from a cup that contained a mixture of honey, milk, and herbs. At another point, their hands were bound together with a cord made of woven grass, symbolizing their connection. And finally, at the climax of the ceremony, they were asked to speak vows to each other. Amara spoke first, in her native language. Thomas did not understand the words, but he understood the emotion behind them. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she held his hands, in the slight trembling of her voice. Whatever doubts she might have had, whatever fears might have lingered, they seemed to melt away as she spoke. She was committing herself to him fully, completely, without reservation. Then, it was Thomas's turn. The old man told him to speak from his heart, to say whatever he truly felt. And so Thomas did. He spoke in English, knowing that most of the people present would not understand his words, but hoping that they would understand his meaning. Amara, he said, I came to Africa looking for treasure. I crossed an ocean, walked through jungles, faced dangers I could never have imagined. And I thought I knew what I was looking for. I thought I wanted gold. I thought I wanted glory. I thought I wanted to make my name famous throughout the world. But I was wrong. I did not know what I was looking for until I found it. And what I found was you. You are my treasure. You are my gold. You are everything I have ever wanted, even though I did not know it until now. I promise to honor you. I promise to protect you. I promise to spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of you. I do not know what the future holds. I do not know what challenges we will face. But I know that as long as I am with you, I can face anything. When he finished speaking, there was a moment of silence. Then, Amara squeezed his hands and smiled at him with tears glistening in her eyes. And then, the crowd erupted in celebration. The drums began again, faster and louder than before. People began singing, dancing, celebrating. Food was brought out, and drinks were poured. The wedding had become a festival that would last through the night. Thomas and Amara were seated in places of honor on the pavilion. People came to pay their respects, to offer gifts, to wish them well. Many of them could not communicate with Thomas directly, but their smiles and gestures conveyed their goodwill. Even the warriors who had wanted him dead just hours ago seemed to have accepted him. He was one of them now. He was family. As the celebration continued, Thomas had a moment alone with Captain Marsh. The captain approached him with a cup of the local brew in his hand and a complicated expression on his face. You know, Captain Marsh said, when I was assigned to lead this expedition, I expected many things. I expected difficulty. I expected danger. I expected to lose men. But I never expected this. Neither did I, Thomas admitted. Do you love her? Truly. Thomas thought about the question. Did he love her? He had known her for less than 2 days. How could anyone fall in love so quickly? And yet, when he thought about leaving her, when he thought about never seeing her again, something inside him ached. It was not logical. It was not sensible. But it was real. I think I do, he said. Or at least, I think I will. Given time. Captain Marsh nodded slowly. Then, I suppose it all worked out for the best. Strange to say that, given the circumstances. But there it is. What will you tell them? Back in England. The truth, mostly. That we found a tribe in the interior. That we made contact. That we established trade relations. That one of our men died of fever along the way. The captain paused. I will not mention the gold I saw on the chief's crown. I will not mention the wealth that surely lies in these lands. Because if I do, others will come. Others who are not as fortunate as you. Others who will bring guns and soldiers and force. And these people, your people now, they deserve better than that. Thomas was surprised by the captain's words. He had always seen Marsh as a hard man, a soldier who followed orders without question. But there was more to him than that. There was a conscience buried beneath the discipline, a soul beneath the uniform. Thank you, Thomas said, for everything. Captain Marsh raised his cup in a mock toast. Thank you for the most interesting expedition of my career. I wish you well, Thomas Whitfield. I have a feeling your adventures are only beginning. The captain walked away, and Thomas turned back to the celebration. Amara was talking with some women from the village, laughing at something they had said. She looked happy, genuinely, completely happy. And Thomas realized that he was happy too. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in his life, he felt at peace. The celebrations continued for 3 days. 3 days of feasting, dancing, music, and ceremony. Thomas was introduced to every elder, every warrior, every important person in the community. He was taught basic words and phrases in the local language. He was shown the village, the surrounding lands, the places that would now be his home. And every night, he fell asleep beside Amara, still marveling at the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. On the 4th day, Captain Marsh and the surviving members of the expedition prepared to leave. The chief, who had warmed considerably toward Thomas and, by extension, toward the other Europeans, provided guides and supplies for their journey back to the coast. There was a formal farewell ceremony, with many speeches and exchanges of gifts. And then, as the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the expedition marched out of the village and disappeared into the forest. Thomas stood at the edge of the village and watched them go. He watched until he could no longer see them, until the last traces of their passage had faded into the green depths of the jungle. He felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief that the ordeal was over. Sadness that he would never see England again, never see his family again. Excitement about the unknown future that lay ahead. And above all, gratitude. Gratitude that he was alive. Gratitude that he had found love in the most unexpected of places. Gratitude that he had been given a second chance at life. Amara came and stood beside him. She took his hand in hers and looked up at him with those beautiful eyes that had captivated him from the first moment he saw her. Are you sad? She asked. A little, he admitted. I am leaving behind everything I have ever known. My country, my people, my past. But you are gaining something too, she said. A new country, new people, a new past that you will build with me. Thomas smiled and squeezed her hand. You are right, as always. She laughed. Remember those words. You will need to repeat them often. They stood there for a while longer, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. Then, hand in hand, they walked back into the village, ready to begin their new life together. The weeks that followed were a period of adjustment for Thomas. Everything was new, everything was strange, everything required learning. The language was the biggest challenge. It was so different from English, so different from any European language he had studied, that he often felt like a child trying to make sense of an adult world. But Amara was patient with him, teaching him word by word, phrase by phrase, correcting his mistakes gently, celebrating his successes warmly. He also had to learn the customs of his new people. There were rules about everything. Rules about how to greet someone older than you. Rules about how to eat in public. Rules about what could be discussed with whom. Rules about marriage, family, religion, work, leisure, death. Some of the rules made sense to Thomas. Others seemed arbitrary and confusing. But he did his best to follow them, knowing that his acceptance in the community depended on his willingness to adapt. The chief, his new father-in-law, remained somewhat distant at first. Thomas understood this. The man had been forced into an impossible situation. His daughter had been compromised, and his only options had been to kill the man responsible or to accept him as family. He had chosen the latter, but that did not mean he had to like it. Thomas resolved to earn the chief's respect over time, through his actions rather than his words. The other villagers were more welcoming. They were fascinated by this strange white man who had somehow ended up among them. They asked endless questions about England, about the sea voyage, about the expedition. They wanted to know about European weapons, European tools, European customs. Thomas answered as best he could, trying to satisfy their curiosity while also being careful not to reveal anything that might put them in danger if other Europeans came in the future. He found himself particularly drawn to the warriors of the village. They were the ones who had surrounded him that first terrifying morning, their spears pointed at his chest. But now, with the situation resolved, they seemed eager to include him in their ranks. They invited him to train with them, to hunt with them, to participate in their rituals. Thomas accepted every invitation, pushing himself to keep up even when his body screamed for rest. He knew that proving himself to the warriors was essential if he wanted to be truly accepted. The training was brutal. Thomas had thought that his military experience had prepared him for physical hardship, but this was different. The warriors ran for miles through rough terrain without breaking a sweat. They climbed trees that Thomas could barely look at without feeling dizzy. They wrestled with a ferocity that left him bruised and battered after every session. But he kept at it, day after day, week after week, refusing to give up, refusing to show weakness. Slowly, the warriors began to respect him, not for his skill, which was still far below theirs, but for his determination. They had expected him to quit, to retreat to the comfort of his hut and his new wife. But he had not. He had kept coming back, kept trying, kept failing, and trying again. That meant something to them. That showed character. The first real turning point came about 2 months after the wedding. A neighboring tribe had been causing trouble, raiding villages, stealing livestock, threatening war. The chief decided to send a group of warriors to investigate the situation and, if necessary, to engage in battle. Thomas asked to be included in the group. The chief was surprised by the request. So were the warriors. They had accepted Thomas as one of them. But taking him into battle was another matter entirely. What if he froze? What if he ran? What if he got himself or others killed? But Thomas was insistent. He argued that he had military experience, that he had faced danger before, that he could handle himself in a fight. He argued that being left behind while his brothers went to war would be a shame he could not bear. He argued and argued until finally the chief relented. The mission lasted 2 weeks. Thomas and 20 other warriors traveled through dense forest and across wide rivers to reach the territory of the hostile tribe. There were skirmishes along the way, brief violent encounters that left Thomas's ears ringing and his hands shaking. But he did not freeze. He did not run. He fought alongside his brothers, protecting them as they protected him, proving himself in the heat of battle. The mission was a success. The hostile tribe agreed to peace negotiations after being shown the strength and determination of their opponents. No major battle was necessary, though several warriors on both sides were wounded in the skirmishes. Thomas himself received a deep cut on his arm that would leave a scar he would carry for the rest of his life. When they returned to the village, they were greeted as heroes. The villagers cheered, children ran alongside them, women brought water and food. And the chief, who had been watching from his position near the great house, walked forward to meet them. He stopped in front of Thomas and looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, he smiled at his son-in-law. "You have proven yourself," the chief said through the old translator who was always nearby. "You are not just the husband of my daughter. You are a warrior of our people. I am proud to call you son." It was a turning point not just in Thomas's relationship with the chief, but in his entire experience in the village. From that day forward, he was no longer seen as an outsider who had married into the tribe. He was seen as a true member of the community, someone who had earned his place through courage and sacrifice. People treated him differently. They sought his advice. They included him in important discussions. They treated him as one of their own. Amara was overjoyed by the change. She had always believed in Thomas, but now others believed in him too. Their marriage, which had begun under such strange circumstances, grew stronger with each passing day. They talked for hours, sharing stories, sharing dreams, sharing fears. They laughed together, cried together, faced the challenges of daily life together. And, slowly, the love that had sparked between them on that first night grew into something deeper, something more solid, something that could weather any storm. But storms were coming. Thomas did not know it yet, but the peace and happiness he had found would soon be tested in ways he could never have imagined. Forces beyond his control were moving in the world outside the village, forces that would eventually reach even this remote corner of Africa. And when they did, Thomas would have to make a choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone he had come to love. For now, though he was content. He had found his place in the world. He had found his home. He had found his purpose. And every morning, when he woke up beside Amara and saw her beautiful face in the light of the African dawn, he thanked whatever gods might be listening for the strange sequence of events that had brought him here. The boy from Ashford who had dreamed of Africa had become a man, a husband, a warrior, a member of a community he had never known existed. And his story, far from being over, was just beginning. Months passed, and Thomas settled into a rhythm of life that he had never expected but found deeply satisfying. He learned to farm, to hunt, to craft tools from wood and stone. He learned the stories of his new people, their history, their mythology, their beliefs about the world, and their place in it. He learned to see the land through their eyes, to appreciate its beauty and respect its dangers. And every day, he felt more connected to this place that had become his home. Amara became his greatest teacher and his closest companion. They spent their days working side by side, and their nights talking under the stars. She taught him not just language and customs, but philosophy. She shared the wisdom that had been passed down through generations, the lessons about life and death, about duty and freedom, about love and sacrifice. And in return, he shared what he knew about the world beyond the forest, about the lands across the sea, about the history and culture of Europe. One evening, as they sat by a fire outside their hut, Amara asked him a question that had clearly been on her mind for some time. "Do you ever regret it?" she said. "Staying here? Giving up everything you knew?" Thomas thought about the question carefully. It was something he had asked himself many times in the early days. Did he regret the choice he had made? Did he wish things had turned out differently? "No," he said finally. "I do not regret it. I miss some things. I miss my family. I miss the food, the weather, the familiar sights and sounds. But I do not regret staying, because staying gave me you. And you are worth more than everything I left behind." Amara smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. "You always know the right thing to say. I learned from the best." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the flames dance in the darkness. And Thomas thought about how strange life could be, how the things you planned almost never happened, and the things you never expected were the ones that changed everything. He had come to Africa seeking treasure. He had found it. But it was not the treasure he had been looking for. It was something far more precious. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the night sky. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of the village settling down for the night, mothers calling children, doors closing, voices fading into silence. It was peaceful. It was beautiful. It was home. And for Thomas Whitfield, the former British soldier who had crossed an ocean and walked through jungles and woken up beside the chief's daughter on a morning that changed everything, that was more than enough. But the peace would not last forever. Nothing ever does. And in the months and years to come, Thomas would face challenges that would test everything he had learned, everything he believed, everything he loved. The world was changing. And change, as it always does, was coming even to this remote village hidden deep in the heart of Africa. Thomas did not know what the future held. He could not see the trials that awaited him, the decisions he would have to make, the sacrifices he would have to offer. All he knew was that whatever came, he would face it with Amara by his side. And that, he believed, was enough. That was more than enough. The story of Thomas Whitfield was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. 3 years had passed since Thomas Whitfield had awakened beside Amara, the daughter of Chief Okoro, and found his life transformed in ways he could never have imagined. 3 years of learning, growing, adapting. 3 years of becoming part of a people and a place that had once been utterly foreign to him. 3 years that had changed him from an English soldier into an African warrior, from an outsider into a trusted member of the community. In those 3 years, much had happened. Thomas had become fluent in the local language, able to speak, joke, argue, and even dream in a tongue that had once sounded like nothing more than strange music to his ears. He had mastered the hunting techniques of his adopted people, learning to track animals through the forest, to read the signs of nature, to move silently through the undergrowth. He had proven himself in battle several times, defending the village against raids and helping to negotiate peace with neighboring tribes. And, most importantly, he had become a father. The birth of his son had been the most terrifying and wonderful experience of Thomas's life. He had paced outside the birthing hut for hours, listening to Amara's cries of pain, wanting desperately to be with her, but forbidden by custom from entering. The old women of the village had gathered to assist with the delivery, their experienced hands guiding the baby into the world. And when the cry of a newborn had finally pierced the night air, Thomas had fallen to his knees and wept with relief and joy. They named the boy Ezra, a name that meant helper in the Hebrew tradition. It was Thomas's choice, a way of honoring his past while embracing his present. Amara had approved, saying that she liked the sound of it, liked the way it felt on her tongue. And Chief Okoro, grandfather now, had given his blessing with a smile that showed how much things had changed between him and his foreign son-in-law. Ezra was 3 years old now, a lively child with his mother's beautiful eyes and his father's stubborn determination. He ran through the village causing chaos and spreading joy wherever he went. The elders spoiled him. The warriors competed to carry him on their shoulders, and the children of the village followed him as if he were their natural leader. Thomas watched his son with a mixture of pride and wonder, marveling at the life he had helped create, the future he had helped shape. But even as Thomas settled into his role as husband, father, and member of the community, the world outside continued to change. News traveled slowly to their remote village, but it traveled nonetheless. Traders who passed through brought stories of white men with guns and machines spreading across the continent like a flood. They spoke of wars being fought, of tribes being conquered, of ancient kingdoms falling before the advance of European power. They spoke of a scramble for Africa, a race among the nations of Europe to claim as much land and as many resources as possible. Thomas listened to these stories with growing concern. He knew better than anyone what European expansion looked like, what it meant for the people who stood in its way. He had been part of that expansion once, a soldier serving the interests of empire. He had seen how treaties were signed and broken, how promises were made and forgotten, how entire peoples were pushed aside in the name of progress and civilization. And he knew that eventually, inevitably, that wave of expansion would reach this village, this community, these people he had come to love. He spoke to Chief Okoro about his concerns. The chief listened carefully, nodding at the appropriate moments, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Thomas finished speaking, the chief was silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "We have heard these stories for many years," the chief said. "My father heard them, and his father before him. The white men come, they take what they want, they leave. We have survived. We will continue to survive. With respect, father," Thomas said, using the term he had been granted permission to use after proving himself in battle. "This time may be different. The Europeans I knew, the ones who sent the expedition I was part of, they are more powerful than you realize. They have weapons that can kill from a great distance. They have machines that can travel faster than any horse. They have numbers that can overwhelm any defense. If they decide to come here, we cannot simply hide in the forest and wait for them to leave." The chief considered this. "What do you suggest?" Thomas had thought about this question for a long time. He had turned it over in his mind during sleepless nights, while hunting in the forest, while playing with his son. And he had come to a conclusion that he knew would be controversial. "We need to prepare," he said. "We need to learn their ways so that we can defend against them. We need to understand their weapons, their tactics, their weaknesses. And we need to unite with other tribes in the region, forming alliances that can present a united front against any invaders." The chief's expression was unreadable. "You are asking us to change, to abandon the ways that have served us for generations. I am asking us to adapt, to take what is useful from the outside world and use it to protect what is valuable in ours. Change is coming whether we want it or not. The only question is whether we will be ready for it." There was another long silence. Then, the chief nodded slowly. "You speak wisdom, my son. I will think on what you have said. We will discuss it with the council of elders. But, for now, we will say nothing of this to others. The people do not need to be worried about dangers that may never come." Thomas accepted this response. He knew that change did not happen quickly in traditional societies. The chief would need time to consider, to consult, to build consensus. It was not the way things were done in the British Army, where orders were given and obeyed without question. But it was the way things were done here, and Thomas had learned to respect it. Months passed. The dry season gave way to the rainy season, and the rainy season gave way to the dry season again. Life in the village continued much as it always had. There were celebrations and mournings, births and deaths, harvests and hunts. Thomas continued to train with the warriors, continued to learn from the elders, continued to love his wife and raise his son. But underneath the surface calm, he felt a growing sense of unease. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones. The feeling was confirmed one evening when a trader arrived in the village with disturbing news. A group of white men had established a trading post 3 days' journey to the south. They were different from the traders who had passed through before. They wore uniforms and carried guns. They had built permanent structures and shown no signs of leaving. They were asking questions about the interior, about the tribes that lived there, about the resources that might be found. Thomas felt his blood run cold. It was beginning. The wave he had feared was finally reaching their shores. He went immediately to Chief Okoro and requested an audience with the Council of Elders. The chief, recognizing the urgency in Thomas's manner, agreed. That night, under the light of torches and the watchful eyes of the ancestors, Thomas addressed the gathered leaders of the community. "Brothers and fathers," he said, speaking in the formal register appropriate for such occasions, "I come before you with heavy heart and urgent words. The time I warned about has arrived. The white men are at our doorstep. We must decide now how we will respond." The elders listened as Thomas described what he knew about European colonization, what he had witnessed during his time in the British Army, what he feared would happen if they did not act. Some of them nodded in agreement. Others looked skeptical. A few seemed openly hostile, as if they blamed Thomas for bringing this trouble to their door simply by being what he was. One elder, a man named Obiora who had never fully accepted Thomas's presence in the village, spoke up. "Why should we listen to you? You are one of them. Perhaps you are a spy, sent ahead to prepare the way for their invasion. Perhaps everything you have done, marrying our chief's daughter, having a child with her, was part of some larger plan." Thomas felt anger rise within him, but forced it down. Obiora's suspicions were understandable, even if they were wrong. In his position, Thomas might have felt the same way. "I understand your concerns," Thomas said calmly. "I cannot prove my loyalty with words. I can only point to my actions over the past 3 years. I have fought for this community. I have bled for it. My son will grow up here, marry here, raise his children here. My fate is bound to yours. If you fall, I fall with you." "Then, what do you propose?" asked another elder, a wise woman named Adiz who was respected for her knowledge of herbs and healing. Thomas outlined his plan. First, they would send scouts to observe the trading post and gather information about the white men who had established it. How many were there? What weapons did they have? What were their intentions? Second, they would begin training the warriors in new tactics, adapting to the threat posed by firearms and European military organization. Third, they would reach out to neighboring tribes, proposing alliances for mutual defense. Fourth, and most controversially, they would attempt to acquire European weapons of their own, whether through trade, theft, or other means. The debate that followed was heated and went on for hours. Some elders supported Thomas's plan enthusiastically. Others opposed it just as strongly. Many fell somewhere in between, agreeing with some aspects while rejecting others. Chief Okoro listened to all perspectives without revealing his own position, as was the custom in such deliberations. Finally, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the chief called for a vote. The council was divided, but a narrow majority supported moving forward with at least some of Thomas's proposals. Scouts would be sent to observe the trading post. Warriors would begin training in new tactics, and envoys would be dispatched to neighboring tribes to explore the possibility of alliances. The question of acquiring European weapons would be deferred for later consideration. It was not everything Thomas had hoped for, but it was a start. As the council dispersed and the village began to wake for another day, Thomas felt a weight settle on his shoulders. He had pushed for action, and action had been approved. Now he would be responsible for making it work. If his plan succeeded, he would be a hero. If they failed, he would be blamed for leading his people into disaster. He found Amara waiting for him outside their hut. She had stayed up all night, unable to sleep while the council debated. When she saw his face, she knew immediately that something significant had happened. "They agreed?" she asked. "Some of it. Enough to begin." Amara nodded slowly. "Then we begin. Together." She reached out and took his hand, and Thomas felt some of the weight lift from his shoulders. He was not alone in this. He had a partner, a helpmate, someone who would stand beside him no matter what came. Whatever happened, they would face it together. The scouts departed 3 days later. Thomas had trained them himself, teaching them what he knew about European camps and how to observe without being detected. They were good men, skilled hunters, experienced warriors. If anyone could get close to the trading post and return with useful information, they could. While waiting for their return, Thomas threw himself into the task of preparing the warriors. He organized training sessions that began at dawn and continued until dusk. He taught them about firearms, explaining how they worked, how to defend against them, how to exploit their weaknesses. He drilled them in new formations that would be more effective against enemies with guns. He pushed them hard, harder than he had ever been pushed in the British Army, knowing that their lives might depend on what they learned. Not all the warriors appreciated his methods. Some resented being trained by a man who had not been born among them, who had come from the very people they might soon be fighting. There were arguments, confrontations, even a few fistfights. But Thomas persisted, and, gradually, respect began to replace resentment. The warriors could see that he knew what he was doing. They could see that he was working just as hard as they were. And they could see, in his eyes, the same determination to protect their home that burned in their own hearts. 2 weeks after their departure, the scouts returned. They had observed the trading post carefully, counting men and weapons, mapping the layout of the buildings, noting the routines of the guards. And they had learned something else, something that made Thomas's blood run cold. The trading post was not just a trading post. It was a staging area. More white men were expected, along with native soldiers who served under European command. Their mission, according to conversations the scouts had overheard, was to push into the interior, to make contact with the tribes there, and to bring them under the authority of the European power they represented. They were coming. And they were coming soon. Thomas shared this information with Chief Okoro and the council. The mood was grim. Even those elders who had been skeptical of Thomas's warnings now recognized the reality of the threat. The question was no longer whether the Europeans would come, but when, and what would be done when they arrived. The council authorized Thomas to accelerate his preparations. More warriors were assigned to training. Messengers were sent to neighboring tribes with greater urgency. Supplies were stockpiled, defenses were strengthened, plans were made for evacuation, if necessary. The village that had been so peaceful and content just months before was now transformed into a community preparing for war. In the midst of all this activity, Thomas found himself thinking about his son. Ezra was too young to understand what was happening, but he could sense the tension in the air, the anxiety in the adults around him. He had become quieter, more clingy, less eager to run off and play with the other children. Thomas tried to spend time with him whenever he could, holding him, talking to him, reassuring him that everything would be all right. But he wondered, in the dark hours of the night, whether that was a promise he could keep. Amara shared his concerns. One night, as they lay together in their hut listening to the sounds of the village settling down for sleep, she asked the question that had been haunting them both. What will happen to Ezra if we cannot stop them? Thomas did not answer immediately. He had thought about this endlessly, running through scenarios in his mind, trying to find a path that led to safety. But every path seemed to lead to the same place. If the Europeans came in force, with guns and soldiers and the full weight of their empire behind them, there was very little that a single village, even a village united with its neighbors, could do to stop them. I do not know, he admitted finally. But I do know that I will do everything in my power to protect him. And you? And everyone here. I will fight until my last breath if I have to. Amara was silent for a moment. Then, she spoke, and her voice was stronger than he expected. I believe you. And I want you to know that I will fight too. I am not just a chief's daughter, waiting for men to decide my fate. I am a mother. I am a wife. I am a woman of this village. And I will defend what is mine with everything I have.